Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Laura Schmitt Olibisi of Michigan State University. Dr. Laura Schmitt Olibisi is an associate professor in the Department of Community Sustainability and the Environmental Science Policy program at Michigan State University. She's an ecologist and a participatory systems modeler working directly with stakeholders to build models that foster adaptive learning about the dynamics of coupled human-natural systems. Laura holds a doctoral degree from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. She was a AAAS Leshner Leadership Institute Public Engagement Fellow in 2018 to 2019. Without further ado, then, I'll turn the webinar over to her. Please go ahead, Laura.
Well, thanks again for that introduction and for having me today. I'm really excited to talk to you about some of this work, particularly applied to African countries, and to follow on the footsteps of my colleagues who I'm sure have done, really interesting work explaining to you participatory modeling and how it can be applied to complex systems problems. So I'm batting cleanup, I guess, and I hope I do it justice. So a little bit about me. Hector mentioned I have a background in ecology and environmental science, but I work in a highly interdisciplinary department, as you can see by the names of the places where I work. And I have been working in countries in Africa for about the last 10 to 12 years. I've worked in, I think, a total of 9 different countries as I counted them up across the continent. And I have current projects in Uganda, Mali, and Nigeria. So what I'll be presenting to you today is just a small selection of some of the work I've done on the continent, but I'm happy to get into more in the Q&A session. I am going to today talk a little bit about participatory modeling. I'm not going to go into great depth there because I understand you've had a couple of previous talks that have laid that out a little bit more. But just as a refresher, or for those who couldn't join previous talks, what is participatory modeling and why do we do it? I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the modeling tools that we can use in a participatory context. I'm going to talk about some of the particular opportunities and challenges of applying those in an African context, give some examples, and then talk about some challenges that we can all work on addressing going forward, hopefully, and then have plenty of time for Q&A. So I look forward to discussion with all of you. So let's see here. So what is participatory modeling and why do we do it? A model, as you may have learned from some of the previous speakers, in its simplest definition is any representation of a system, right? And when you're doing participatory modeling, you are constructing that representation together with people who have particular expertise in the system, but who are not necessarily modelers. So they may live in the system, they may work in the system, they may have a stake in the system in some way. And so you're involving them in the modeling process in some way. So that's what participatory modeling is. If you look at the literature, which has been burgeoning over the last couple of decades around participatory modeling, you can find 4 major arguments for why you would want to do this, right? Why you would want to involve people who have a specific expertise in the system in constructing the model and not just kind of go off into your room as a modeler and do it yourself. So one argument is a justice argument, right? Increasingly, models are being used to influence public policy and public decision-making. And there's an argument that if those models are influencing decisions that are going to have an impact on people's lives and livelihoods, the people who are going to be affected by those decisions should have some say in how the model is constructed that's going to influence that, right? So, what variables go into it, what the system looks like, et cetera. So kind of including that voice in decision making. There's also a buy-in argument. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But basically, this arises from the observation that if you have the modelers kind of go off into their own room, build the model, bring it to the decision makers, it might be a great model. It might be very scientifically robust. But at the end of the day, if the decision makers don't trust the model, or they don't think you asked the right questions, or they just don't particularly want to use it, that whole exercise was kind of a waste, right? So getting decision makers and people who are going to implement the recommendations of the model into the process itself gives them more of a stake. It gives them more of a motivation to actually act on the results of the model. Then there's the argument that if we're dealing with complex systems, particularly, we cannot come to good scientific conclusions about that system without including a range of viewpoints in describing the system. So, this is an argument made in a lot of the sustainability science literature, for example, or the socio-ecological systems literature, that teams of scientists on their own simply cannot describe a complex socio-environmental system without the voices of the people who live in that system, who have a specific kind of knowledge. And then the final reason why we might do participatory modeling is so that we can learn, right? We can learn from each other. We can learn about the system. We're bringing people together who might not have talked to each other from before to discuss a particular problem in a particular context, to unearth their assumptions about that problem. And there's a lot of learning that can occur there. So for these 4 reasons, these are the main ones kind of in the literature about why we might want to do this. Marianne Vandenbelt, in her seminal book, Mediated Modeling is kind of another term for participatory modeling, describes the whole kind of buy-in argument along these 2 axes, right? So if we're trying to inform a decision, and what we want is both a high degree of understanding of how the system works, and we want a high degree of consensus around what we should do about it, about a given problem, then we can, the status quo where we are now, I would, in a lot of cases, is a confrontational debate and no improvement. Sounds familiar, right? Anybody who's been following politics in any country. So if we have the expert modelers kind of go into their own room and construct a model, it might, again, be a scientifically sound model, but its recommendations may never be implemented because they simply lack support. People don't know how you got this model. They don't necessarily trust it, et cetera. On the other hand, if you use a more traditional kind of facilitated exercise where you're mediating a discussion among stakeholders, that might be very successful. In the best case, you might come to consensus on what the goals and the problems are, but you may not necessarily know how to achieve them because you still don't have a good grasp about how the system works and how to push it towards the outcome you want. So Vandenbelt argues that mediated modeling can kind of combine those 2 and get you both consensus on problems and goals and a sense of what the process is that leads to an effective policy and effective decision to move the system where you want to go. So that's her argument. Okay, so that's why we do participatory modeling. And there's a lot of different kinds of participatory modeling. So I understand that you already heard from my colleagues who talked about fuzzy cognitive mapping, Bayesian modeling, and we have somebody on the call today who's a Bayesian, which is excellent. I know very, very little about that. So, and then Moira, of course, talked about agent-based modeling. Today, I'm going to focus mainly on system dynamics modeling, which is my particular area of expertise. That's the tool I most often use. I have also worked with scenario planning, role-playing games, and process-based modeling, as well as collaborated with agent-based modelers and fuzzy cognitive mappers. So we can talk about those techniques in the Q&A if you'd like. But in the interest of time, I'm focusing on one piece of that. But you can just be aware that there is a wide range of tools and techniques that have been used in participatory ways in the literature, if you want to look further into that. So for those of you unfamiliar with system dynamics modeling, and again, I apologize, this is a very crash overview. If you have more questions about system dynamics in particular, I can answer them in the Q&A. But system dynamics is a type of quantitative simulation modeling. It's about half a century old, well, actually older, like about 70 years old at this point. It's based on a stock and flow structure. So you have typically an amount of something, either, tangible, concrete, or abstract that's accumulating, and then you have flows that increase or decrease that amount. And it explicitly incorporates feedback. So you have both reinforcing and balancing feedback loops typically in a system dynamics model. It's a very aggregate type of model. So unlike agent-based modeling, where you have emergent behavior that's kind of bubbling up from the bottom from individual agents interacting. It's much more of a kind of top-down structural simulation in the aggregate. So it would not be particularly good, for example, at looking at how interactions between individual households might lead to an outcome, for example, but it could be really good at looking at how decisions at a structural level are going to push the system in a certain way. And I'll give examples of that will hopefully clarify. So here's a very simple system dynamics model. You have, if you're modeling climate change, you would have a stock of carbon in the atmosphere. And in fact, this is a very simplified version of models that are used to look at climate forcing. You have a stock of carbon in the atmosphere. When you burn fossil fuels, you add to that. So that's the inflow. When plants photosynthesize, they take up the carbon, that's the outflow. And then you have a balancing feedback loop here because of the CO2 fertilization effect on plants. So the more carbon in the atmosphere, in some cases, the more plants uptake, and that reduces the stock over time. So it's an equilibrium effect. So system dynamics is particularly effective in systems where you know that there are feedback effects happening. But I want to take a step back from the technical tools too and remind us all of a point that hopefully my colleagues made as well, which is that participatory modeling is not just about the cool modeling tools and the equations, right? In fact, it isn't even primarily about that. If you look at the goals of the exercise that I put up on the first slide, in order to achieve justice, to achieve learning, to achieve buy-in, to achieve a better scientific understanding, you need a good process as well, and you need good partnerships. You need people to come together around the table, and you need to be effectively engaging them and integrating their knowledge, right? So that is a lot of you might call them soft skills that modelers don't typically learn when they're going through the process of learning modeling, okay? And that is equally important to the results that you get from a system dynamics model in a participatory way or any model in a participatory way. And of the two examples I give, I think that the second one will kind of illustrate that, hopefully. So it's not just about the products, it's not just about the cool models, it's about the people involved and how you engage them. So, it looks like a few of you work in African countries and some of you don't. My perspective, again, from, the decade, 12 years or so that I've worked on the continent, this is a continent that has a lot of complex systems problems that are suited to a participatory modeling approach, right? So The Economist is not the only publication to have deemed this century the century of Africa, right? This is a continent that is growing demographically. One of my favorite statistics is that of the human beings added to the planet between now and 2100, 1 in 2 will be African. So this continent is going to dominate demographically. It's a rapidly urbanizing continent. It's a rapidly economically developing continent. There's massive cultural changes going on, social changes going on. It just is a hugely dynamic continent, right? With a lot of complex systems issues to deal with. And we also know that it is a continent that's going to be heavily impacted by climate change. So on a continent that has a lot of land and water, but where yields are still pretty low, by some estimates, climate change is going to knock yields of staple crops back by 25%, right? And you combine that with the demographic growth and the urbanization, I mean, that presents a lot of really complex challenges. So this is a continent where we need kind of all hands on deck, solving problems. There's a lot of inequality and inability of people to access decision processes, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So this is really a place where I think we need these tools to be activated. So I'm going to give a couple examples today, as I said, of work that I've done, and I'm going to give 2 different examples from across different countries on the continent. So hopefully we get a little geographic representation. And a little bit of representation of the modeling product and the modeling process and how those can both lead to improved outcomes. So the first one I'm going to talk about is a project that I did with some colleagues at Michigan State and in Zambia a few years ago, excuse me, where we were approached by USAID, by a program officer at USAID. the U.S. Agency for International Development. And they were wondering if their investments in Zambia, particularly in smallholder agriculture conservation, were acting at cross purposes with their investments in biodiversity conservation. So their logic was this. They're saying, look, we are supporting smallholder farmers who live near the national parks to use conservation agriculture so that they don't have to expand their fields every year. They don't have to go out and clear new land because their field is fertile year upon year. But what we're worried about is that are we creating some unintended outcomes? Because if the farmers are making more yields year on year and that yield is sustainable, then they may have more money to go out and hire labor to clear a larger field and farm more. So are these investments actually working at cross purposes, right? Because those are our two major goals in the country, is supporting smallholder farmers and biodiversity conservation. And they approached my colleague, Robbie Richardson, about this, and Robbie was like, I'm not a systems modeler, but this sounds like a systems problem, because what we were asking about is, are there unintended consequences of this decision, right? Are there systems consequences that are feeding back in ways that we didn't realize? So he came to me and he said, hey, can we make a system dynamics model of this? And I said, sure, why not? So we went to Zambia, and we were tasked with looking at the deforestation dynamics in Lusaka province and in Eastern province. And these are two very different parts of the country. So Lusaka province, of course, houses the capital and largest city, Lusaka. So it's very urban or peri-urban. And Eastern province is a much more remote province. It houses some national parks and game areas, and it's still very heavily forested. So we're kind of looking at deforestation dynamics in very, very different parts of the country to kind of get a continuum or a spectrum of how those play out. So what USAID did is they assembled all of their funded projects and asked them to come to a workshop, which we facilitated. And at that workshop, we had them draw on paper a causal loop diagram, which is the building block of a system dynamics model. Now, this project took place a few years ago, before I knew, when I was facilitating a workshop, to task somebody else with taking pictures, because I'm always busy facilitating. So I don't unfortunately have any good pictures of people actually drawing these diagrams. I'll show you some from Nigeria in a minute. But this is one of the diagrams they drew, translated into an online model, or a modeling software called Vensim, which some of you may have used. So we asked them to draw these diagrams around the focal question, what is causing deforestation in the region where you work, and what are the impacts of that deforestation? And so you can see that this group of people drew a diagram depicting how deforestation impacts both wildlife and smallholder income. And then they talked about the different things that cause deforestation, including agricultural land clearing, fuelwood harvesting, and charcoaling. Now, an interesting point was that when we went into this project, I started reading up on the information we had about deforestation in Zambia. And I would say, 90% of it or more was talking about deforestation for agriculture, clearing for agriculture, smallholder agricultural households clearing land, that was the big cause of deforestation. So this seemed to be, and often this was cited without a lot of supporting evidence or data. So it seemed to be a widely held kind of assumption that the main problem here is that farmers are clearing land, right? And as we progressed in this project, we found that it probably would be wise to question that assumption. So I'll talk about that in a minute. So I'm doing something here which I tell my students never to do, so I apologize for that. I'm showing you a model diagram that I know that you cannot read or see, and I tell my students don't ever do that in a presentation. But I am doing this not so that you can read it, but to make the point that we took that diagram and we translated it into a quantitative simulation model with a basic stock and flow structure. And in this case, the structure was that land moves from a forested category into a degraded category in response to those different drivers. And so this is just so that you can see the range of variables that we assembled from the stakeholders involved into this model. I will add that when we were doing this, we found that there were some voices that were missing, right? So we realized that we needed to go out and talk to village chiefs to understand how land was allocated in a traditional way. We realized that we had to go talk to women and find out how they thought about fuelwood harvesting. We had to go talk to wildlife conservation experts. So we conducted additional interviews as we were building the model, because we said that these are kind of gaps in knowledge that we need to fill. So here is the simulation output of the model. We simulated it from 2010 to 2060, as you can see, over time. And I can talk about model validation and sensitivity analysis in the Q&A. I won't go into that here, but I will say that we checked it, the robustness of the model in several ways, as we do with all system dynamics models that we build for policy purposes. So this tells us an interesting story, right? Because what this tells us is that, yes, deforestation for agriculture in Zambia at the national level is the dominant story right now. But look at that red line rapidly catching up to it, right? That is forest clearing for charcoal. So Zambia is, again, a rapidly growing, rapidly urbanizing country. And the urban population primarily uses charcoal for cooking. Even when they have access to gas or electric stoves, meaning that they're wealthier households, they often prefer to use charcoal for cooking. And if they have electric stoves, the electricity is often not reliable, right? So as the population grows, as it becomes wealthier and more urban, and they're cooking more things like meat, that line is going to go up, and it's going to take a toll on Zambia's forests. And when we went into this project, nobody was talking about charcoal. And so this is something that we unearthed as, hey, maybe this is something we should really pay attention to, right? And particularly in Lusaka province, the urban province that I mentioned, you can see that it may be that right now charcoal is actually the dominant driver in the system in terms of driving deforestation, more so than clearing for agriculture, which makes sense, right? In your urban or peri-urban area, you have less agriculture, but charcoal is more of a higher value product that they're selling to urban households. So we tested a number of policy scenarios, and I don't have time to get into all of them here, but once you understand the causes of the problem that you're looking at, you can say, okay, well, how could we address it? And so if the problem, in fact, is forest clearing for charcoal, what would happen if you had reliable electricity in all urban areas, such that you have people that can actually use their electric stoves, you have some impetus to use electric stoves, and you can see that in fact would have a pretty big impact on preserving forest. So in this case, the model was really helpful in kind of questioning the assumptions that people, I would say, mostly across the board had about why deforestation was occurring and how to address it. Because the main learning that we got out of this was that charcoal and agriculture are both very important deforestation stories. And any policy or decision considerations that don't include the former are ultimately not going to be as effective, right? A secondary point that we found was that agricultural land clearing is more so driven by rural population growth and not by low yields or land abandonment. So in a way, we found evidence that helped USAID rest a little bit easier that no, boosting yields is probably not driving, agricultural land clearing. It's more rural population growth that's doing that. And also some demographic shifts around the country. So I think this is a good example of a project in which the model itself yielded helpful decision input and helpful kind of products in that sense. It was the model that was useful. And now I'm going to talk about another example from Nigeria, in which the process of building this model was extremely helpful and yielded some kind of unanticipated fruits. So this is a project that was funded by the Alliance for African Partnership through Michigan State University. And this was in collaboration with, there's me on the left, obviously, there's my PhD student, Ghana is the gentleman standing in the center there, my former PhD student. And shaking his hand is Dr. Buki Oshintade. So she was our local collaborator. She's now at Babcock University in Nigeria. And on the right is my colleague at MSU, Dr. Soweto Liverpool-Tazier, and she was the director of the overall Nigeria Agricultural Policy Project that was kind of collaborating with this smaller project. So Buki was the one who got us in touch with all of these stakeholders in the poultry sector in Nigeria. And the poultry sector is very important for a couple of reasons. One is economically, that this is the way a lot of small households make extra money by raising and selling poultry. It's also a main source of protein for folks in a country that, again, is just huge demographically and growing rapidly and urbanizing rapidly. So the future of the poultry sector is really important to the future of agriculture in Nigeria. And there's some evidence that it's going to be impacted in different ways by climate change. So we wanted to explore that, look at potential futures, get a sense from the stakeholders of how those impacts could be mitigated. So this time I did assign someone to take a picture of people actually doing the diagramming in the workshop. So this is a picture of a workshop that we did in Abeokuta, Nigeria. So we did 3 different workshops in different parts of the country. These are all poultry sector stakeholders who were assembled in the same room really for the first time. So pictured here, you can see veterinarians, you can see scientists, you can see poultry farmers, retailers, wholesalers of poultry, feed wholesalers. So people at different points in the poultry value chain, as economists put it, coming together to kind of give their outlook on the poultry sector in Nigeria. And here's an example of a causal loop diagram that one group drew under the focal question, what is impacting poultry production in Nigeria? What is going to impact it into the future, and what are the potential, ramifications of that? So encouraging them to think in feedback terms. From those diagrams, we assembled again a quantitative simulation model using system dynamics tools. This is a simplified version of that model. So unlike the first one, you can actually kind of see and read this one because we took out a lot of the other variables, and this is just the basic stock and flow structure. So we simulated the production of poultry, which then is, so there's a production flow, and then there's an import flow leading to the number of birds available for purchase. Then you have the outflows are consumption of poultry, and then, poultry deaths, which are impacted by climate change through both extreme heat and disease, right? So those are the things we learned from the workshops. So again, we simulated a number of different futures and policy choices in the model. And I actually I can drop this link in the chat. There's an online version of this model. If any of you would like to check it out yourselves, you can run your own scenarios there. But this is one thing that we did is we simulated poultry deaths under climate change as a result of disease and extreme heat. And we had a lot of conversation around that and how that could happen and the stochasticity of it. So you can add stochasticity into a system dynamics model. And one of the cool things that came out of this exercise is that the participants themselves decided to organize themselves to produce brochures for poultry farmers around how to mitigate the impacts of climate change on your poultry operation. So they, in this room, kind of put their heads together, came up with recommendations. We facilitated a little bit, but they mainly developed a brochure, which they then translated into the 3 most widely spoken Nigerian languages, Igbo, Hausa, and Yoruba. This is the Igbo version. Okuku means chicken in Igbo, in case you wondered. And they distributed it through their networks. So to me, this is an example of, okay, the model was kind of helpful, but the real point of this that really yielded fruit, I think, was getting all of these people together in a room and harnessing their collective knowledge that's actually going to help farmers adapt to the impacts of climate change now and into the future in a very locally appropriate way. So that was really cool to see, and it was fun to be involved with. Okay, so I talked about a couple of examples of how this can work well. But I think it's good to also be open about the challenges we face in doing this work, right? and particularly the challenges in an African context, which are in some ways unique, and in some ways, these are challenges for anybody doing this kind of work in any part of the world. So the first challenge is, who is going to do this work? So any of us who work in Africa know that this is a continent that is very underserved in terms of higher education and in terms of technical training. So there often are relatively few people that even, have the ability to contemplate learning system dynamics, right? Or taking this on in a university context or in a technical context. And system dynamics, kind of like agent-based modeling and maybe unlike some other more qualitative tools, really does take some technical expertise to do, right? You have to know calculus and be skilled in mathematics to build these models. So all of these projects that I described were a paradigm of me as a foreigner coming in to do this project. And we, of course, left as much as possible, the learning from the project and the products, with the people who were wanting them. But we didn't really leave the capacity there. And that's an ongoing challenge. How do we train and equip African scientists and modelers to be doing this kind of work? And I believe that's vitally important, because we cannot, still be doing this model of like the foreigners coming in and doing it. There are African students, studying abroad and learning these techniques. And I just got contacted, leave it to the Nigerians to be the innovators. I just got contacted by the new Nigerian chapter of the System Dynamics Society, contacted me on Twitter over the summer. So they're forming too, which is awesome. But the point is that there's just there needs to be so much capacity built to do this work on the continent. Okay. The second challenge is whose voice is heard, right? So I included this picture at the beginning of the talk. This picture is from probably one of the most challenging and most touching modeling efforts that I've ever facilitated. And this was not a system dynamics modeling exercise. This was a scenario exercise, but this was taking place in a village in southeastern Nigeria, in which almost the entire village was not literate. So we had only a few, I would say 4 or 5 people in the village who could read or write in any language, and they were all men. And we had another translation problem in this, which I'll talk about in a minute, in the sense that the translator that we brought to the village to work with us got there and was like, oh, these people actually don't speak the dialect that I know. I have no idea what they're saying. So we had to, on the spot, recruit a Bible translator who lived in the village, who could help us translate from English into the local language. And the point being that there's a lot of literature on development in Africa that suggests that there are many voices that have been left out of conversations around development, around technology, around decision-making, around policy, because we as human beings tend to go to people we feel most comfortable with and that we can talk to the easiest. And so for those of us from, Western scientific backgrounds, that's going to be, people who are formally educated, people who speak English. Often they're men. There's a whole literature on how women's voices have been left out of technology and process design in an African context. So this is something we have to be very careful and very aware of, right? When we're doing any participatory research, including participatory modeling, whose voices are we including? Whose are we leaving out? How are we making an effort to bridge these communication divides, right, if they exist? So in this case, this woman here, she's not literate, but we had a translator stand behind the desk where we wrote different concepts. So in this case, they're voting for concepts to be included in the modeling work, variables to be included. And, she told the translator what she thought was important, and he directed her like where she could put her mark, next to the concept she wanted to be included. So we had to kind of, make that up on the spot. So something to think about, that this is a continent that does have really large inequalities, really large kind of power imbalances and dynamics. And I think whenever we go into a community, we need to be conscious of not perpetuating that, right? So I mentioned the language thing. Africa is one of the most linguistically diverse continents, probably comparable to South Asia in that sense, that if you're doing a study that involves 3 different villages that are 10 miles apart, you might have 3 different radically different languages involved, right? And I have found this very challenging in working with system dynamics, because the software, the materials, the examples, almost all of them are in English, and almost all of them are very kind of Western culture context specific. Just a quick example, the description of reinforcing and balancing feedback, often the example for balancing feedback is a house thermostat, right? That when the house gets cold, it turns on the heat, and when the house gets hot, it turns on the air conditioning. Well, that doesn't register for anybody living in a tropical village in sub-Saharan Africa, right? They don't have thermostats in their houses. So that's just one example of how the language of system dynamics is very Western, and it doesn't often translate. And there is a call in the system dynamics community, in the systems modeling community, to incorporate more non-Western knowledge bases, more indigenous knowledge bases into our discussion of systems change and systems modeling. I think that's a welcome conversation. I think it's long overdue. And it's true that, people who are living in environmental systems and agricultural systems often have a very deep understanding of system dynamics and things like feedback that often Western educated scientists struggle to achieve, right? Because we're trained in a very linear thinking way often. So I welcome more tools and processes and materials that are fluent in a range of languages, not just actual spoken tongues, but in different cultural contexts. And that will come, I think, with more people in the field who are diverse. Okay, so that's the last point I'm going to make. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of my collaborators that were involved in all of these projects, including the folks, the farmers, the folks in the villages that we talked to, my collaborators at Michigan State and African universities. And I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I welcome any questions and discussion.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I've got a lot of questions of my own, but I do want to, first of all, before I monopolize the conversation, I want to have the audience the opportunity to ask questions. Yeah, Dave says he's also got a bunch. But so let me start with at least one of his, and then I'll give the audience an opportunity to enter their own. So this has to do with the very beginning of your presentation, when you talk about the different tools that can be used in participatory modeling. And Dave would like to ask you to say something perhaps about choosing the right tool for the situation at hand. Why would you use one approach versus the other?
Well, good question, Dave. So we actually have a paper about that, which I will pop into the chat here, if I can. Okay, I'll find it in a minute. But we actually wrote a paper about selecting the right tool for a participatory modeling application. And the short answer is that there's a lot of different considerations that you have to kind of weigh. But the overall point I would make is that, oftentimes modelers are trained in one technique, which makes sense because, these are very time intensive and technical techniques to learn. So we tend to learn kind of one technique, but then we have a hammer, and so everything looks like a nail, right? So part of what we modelers need to get better at is learning the range of techniques that are out there and what they're appropriate for and what they're not appropriate for. And so this paper was an attempt of ours to kind of lay that out a little bit. So I will say that some things you would want to consider are how much time do you have to do this? How much money do you have? Those things are often very tied together. what is the degree of aggregation that you want, right? So I mentioned, for example, that if you're really looking at individual behavior and how that produces an emergent effect, you might want to do agent-based modeling. But if you're interested in more of an aggregate systems view, system dynamics modeling is fine. Do you want quantitative or qualitative output? Things like that. So there's a range of considerations that you can use to select. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Before I go on to the next question, I just want to point out that when I mentioned that I work in Africa, I kind of left out the fact that there are a couple of people on the call that actually live and work in Africa. So it would be very,
Awesome.
very like Fred Rose Okumu and Kelly Lekwape. But it would be very interesting to and Willie Tanu, who just wrote a question, so I'll go to him next. But it would be very interesting to hear from them, particularly when in terms of the talking about the challenges that you mentioned in your talk and implementing it.
For sure.
So let me go to Willie, because he would like to ask if you could tell us more about how you managed to train the scientists and collaborators who you worked with in that project, and what were their academic backgrounds and experiences. Yeah, I'd be interested in that too. And I want to follow up on that question after I hear your answer.
Sure. Yeah, well, Willie, as I mentioned, this is kind of an ongoing challenge because so I teach a system dynamics course at Michigan State University, and that's a 14-week course, right? And so that's how long it takes people to learn system dynamics. And the prerequisites for that are things like, calculus, and because it's around environmental issues, ecology, right? So, and it's at the graduate level. So that gives you a sense of like kind of the level at which you have to be kind of trained to do this. Now, I will say that a couple of years ago, with my Malian collaborator, we did a 1-week field school in Mali, and we attempted to teach system dynamics modeling in a week, and we were kind of successful. But the one thing we failed to do was set up, kind of a robust container for a community of practice once the field school was over, and then COVID hit, and they weren't able to meet in person, and so it kind of disintegrated. But one thing we found is that, yes, it is possible to teach these tools in a shorter range of time. It is a significant time commitment though, right? So sometimes I work with folks who are like, never mind, you can do the modeling. I don't care. I don't care to learn. Just, show me how you got the results that you did. I see how you put the variables in. And then, there's a few people who are going to want to really dig into the details and learn it. So for those, I've traditionally done that by bringing them to MSU and having them engage in my course, or I think this field school model is one that I'd like to go further with. And if you're interested, let's talk about it, because I'd love to help others roll it out. Yeah.
Well, so yeah, we are actually very interested at Gene Convene, and particularly we're wrestling right now with this actual question of how do you build capacity in on the continent to do this type of work. And we'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about where we might, what institutions we might be partnering with to roll out some kind of program on this.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's talk later.
Yeah, for sure. I should mention too, there are also a couple of very good online courses for learning system dynamics. Those have proliferated during the pandemic, as many online things. And, there's one offered through Worcester Polytechnic Institute, for example. They're a few $100s, so, relatively affordable, but of course out of reach for many folks at African institutions. So there's that too. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. So we'll loop back to you on that.
Yeah, great.
Dave, yeah, and Willie does say he'd like to follow up with you too on email to collaborate further. Dave Obrakta does also ask whether you could talk a little bit more about the details of the actual process, because he mentions that you had a lot of people who were from all different types of levels of education, etc. And so he was amazed that in, for example, your Nigerian example, the folks who were creating causal loop diagrams. Could you go into a little bit more detail about how that happened procedurally?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to put something else in the chat. This is a great resource with a caveat. Okay, so there's a wiki called Scriptopedia for people doing participatory system dynamics exercises that basically has a set of like, here are some scripts for a workshop if you want to like build a causal loop diagram. You want to, now I will say that, again, this is very much from a Western context, right? So these scripts will say something like, get a room with a whiteboard and have everybody, bring their computer, and I've had to do these things, out under a tree in a village with a piece of paper, right? So your mileage may vary and you might have to adapt these, but it is a great resource if you're interested in like step-by-step, how do I actually do this? So for causal loop diagramming, what I typically do is introduce people to the concept of systems and emergent behavior and feedback. And most of the time people grasp that pretty quickly, actually. And then we just practice, we have a focal question that we agree on. We're going to diagram this question. This is the focal concept here. So I gave you the examples that in Zambia, it was deforestation. In Nigeria, it was productivity of the poultry sector. And then we just start drawing. I have people start putting down causes and potential consequences. It's kind of similar to, I think you all did something similar with Stephen Gray a few weeks ago. It's very similar to what he does when he's making an FCM. Except he does it on the computer. And I really like to use paper. I really like people to like write their own stuff. Yeah. So then we get a bunch of these diagrams. And then what I typically do is I have each small group that has created a diagram explain it so that I can, so the group can understand what they're saying and so that I can get an insight into, okay, well, what does this concept actually mean? How did you define it? Why is this causal arrow going this way? And sometimes we agree that actually it's not, it's going the other way. So then I have these causal loop diagrams that I can hopefully combine to make a group model. Yeah.
I just want to share a couple of comments before I go on to another question. Actually, Wayne Landis, whom you talked to just briefly at the beginning of your presentation, said, yeah, he really appreciates your presentation today. And he says that when he and his team build Bayesian cause effect diagrams, they go through a similar type of thing, particularly focused on risk assessment. So I think that just illustrates how adaptable this is to various tools.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would love to go to a Bayesian workshop someday. I haven't seen it yet, but I would love to. Maybe the next one you guys hold. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it would be interesting to see how a Bayesian network example might be implemented in the areas where you've been using your systems diagram work.
Sure.
And then Brenda Das says that setting up a community of practice is definitely of interest for a variety of reasons, and that's sort of a corollary to what I was just talking about, an interest that we have at Gene Convene, which is not just establishing some kind of program where folks will be capable of going out and doing this and training the trainers, but also sustaining that over a long period of time so that there's a continuing call for this kind of expertise, because we don't want to just have a small cadre of people whose capacity is built for a particular purpose and then they sit idle for a while.
Right.
So the realization that there might be that there will be a whole host of different areas that they can apply these different tools to, and
sure,
and use these approaches can be really valuable.
Sure. Well, I mean, the good news is that what the pandemic did, one outcome is it moved so many things to an online space, and so I've seen some online learning platforms and community of practices for system dynamics pop up over the last couple of years, which I think are great. That didn't necessarily exist a lot before. So, I think anything going forward is going to have to be at least partially located in the virtual space, right? And that's a great opportunity potentially. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned, for example, the System Dynamics Society. So in Nigeria, so there are other professional associations like that that are being established elsewhere.
Yeah, well, the System Dynamics Society is an international society for system dynamics modelers, and they have a kind of subgroup focused on participatory modeling. And so, yeah, I guess the person who contacted me was the guy from Nigeria who wanted to form a Nigerian chapter. So, yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
So Dave asks, in your Zambia project, were you interacting with policy types in that country, and how receptive to the models were they? And I have a follow-up question from that.
Okay.
Okay.
So our client in that case was USAID. And I will say that was a very interesting project because the USAID folks from Washington, D.C., not from the mission in Zambia, but from Washington, D.C., were highly, highly skeptical of this approach. So during the first workshop, they were resistant to the point of even being actively hostile to what we were doing. You know, they were saying things like, why are you wasting these people's time? We all know what causes deforestation. Like, why are you, you know, this is silly. I mean, I think that their view was like, oh, we're just drawing things with, like, we're just coloring, right? We're just drawing things with markers. What's the point of this? I will tell you that by the end of the project, they were singing the praises of this technique. And I think that, again, you know, the things that they thought were obvious, like, well, everybody knows what's causing deforestation. Everybody knows what we should do about it. Turned out not to be so obvious, right? And that's exactly what happens when you're working in a complex system. We all need to kind of relax our assumptions. And so, yeah, they were, that was the most pushback we got. In the Zambia side, we were working with the USAID Zambia mission, obviously, and then we were working with some local leaders from the communities where a lot of this deforestation was taking place, and they were actually, I found, quite receptive to this. You know, again, I find that people who are living in a complex systems context and making decisions in that often are very receptive to an understanding of the concept of feedback and unintended consequences, because I see it every day, right? So yeah.
I'm going to wait until the clock in the background stops chiming, and if you can hear that, it's almost done. Anyway, what I actually wanted to share with you was an experience that Dave and I had yesterday when we were talking about participatory modeling to an audience at AUD and EPAD. This has to do with the resistance because there does seem to be still some kind of skepticism about the use of models and how accurately they might reflect reality, and also just the initial assumption that in order to actually use and understand the models and be part of a model, being able to build these models, is you need to have this higher level of mathematical competency. But as you mentioned, and as you've shown, that there doesn't have to be in order to participate meaningfully in these activities. But I do want to push back a little bit, and that is, if you could tell me, there were some assumptions or some conclusions that you reached in the Zambia example that you gave, that it seemed to me really begged for validation, and you invited the discussion about validation in the Q&A, so I'm going to do that now. So those assumptions or those conclusions you reached, was there follow-up on actually data gathering and validation of those conclusions?
Yes, there was. So sorry, Dave said models do not have to equal math. Yes, 100%. Good point, and I concur completely. So yes, so we did we did validate the Zambia model, and any model that we use to inform, policy or decision making has to run through some validation checks. I will say that with system dynamics, the validation process is a little bit different than you may be used to for things like statistical models or process-based models. So the point of a system dynamics model is to understand what structures are driving system behavior, right? And how those structures can be disrupted if we want different behavior, or how they can be augmented if we want more of the same behavior. So the point is not to give an estimate of, in 2030, we will have exactly 135,750 acres of forest in this region. If, that is not the purpose, and it's not appropriately used for that, but it is appropriately used for, okay, here are the drivers, and here's where this is taking us, and here's how to change that. So we validated the model in a number of different ways. We did have some satellite data around deforestation that we applied to the model, and the USAID mission in Zambia collected that. So we're able to compare our estimates of deforestation with the satellite measured, and they were pretty close. They were comfortably close enough for me to say, okay, this model is not wildly off. We also, through my colleague's work, who was working on this model, he had done quite a bit of research on charcoal and charcoal production in Zambia. So we were able to get some data on charcoal sales and imports and exports from the country borders, including some that is illegal, but it's still happening. And again, we were able to kind of say, okay, the numbers we're including here for charcoal production are not wildly off. Like they match approximately with what we're seeing here. And then the other thing is that, and this is a critical part of validating a system dynamics model, we shopped this model around, as I mentioned, to a lot of people who knew how the system functions. And we showed it to them, and we said, to these village chiefs, to the conservation experts, said, does this make sense to you? Here's what this model is telling us. Here are the relationships. What are your thoughts? And based on that, we were able to get confirmation that the logic of the model was sound. And in some cases, people said, well, no, actually, there's this piece that doesn't make sense, and pushed back on it. One example of that is originally we had fuel wood collection driving a portion of deforestation, but then people pointed out that fuel wood that is collected is predominantly downed wood unless there is no other option. So then we added that in and found that the estimate of fuel wood contribution to deforestation dropped dramatically, because that was an important dynamic to include. So yeah, we validated the model in several ways. Yeah. Oh, you're muted, Hector.
Sorry, I touched the mute button. So a practical question again from Dave, back to your Nigeria example, is how many meetings and convenings were needed actually in order to get a product like the one you were describing?
So we had 3 workshops over about an 18-month period, I believe. Yeah, about 18 months. And so we were kind of modeling in between those. So we had the first 2 workshops in, I think that was 2018, and then, if I'm remembering that right, or 20, yeah, and then the final one in 2019. And so then we had at the final workshop, we unveiled the model and had people comment on it. So yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Let me just see whether we've covered all of the questions and comments. Wayne Landis is gone already because he had to go to another call, but he did point out a resource that people might be interested in, which actually is a book that I started to read.
Okay.
It's the Judea Pearl's book on the Book of Why.
Cool. Okay.
So anyway, I have found it pretty to talk about just the general thinking around modeling and particularly
cool.
causal thinking.
Great.
Anyway, it's also a good audio book. That's actually how I'm going through it.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, we definitely need to talk more. Dave
Yeah, I have a
says.
lot more stories. I only,
Yeah.
this is the tip of the iceberg today.
Okay. Yeah. So much more to follow up on for sure. And
Yeah.
but I think we've covered all of the questions for today, and I really thank you. Uh, there's a great deal of excitement among some of us at Gene Convene about this, and so definitely we'll be following up on the things with you and Stephen and Moira and others, because we find that we think that's going to be very, very useful and helpful for applications in all sorts of different fields, and in, but especially in thinking about the complex problems that will face regulators and decision makers concerning gene drives.
Yeah.
And so we'll definitely uh, be calling on you guys for more conversation about this as we go forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and anybody who attended who wants to get in touch with me, you can share my email. You
Sure.
have it obviously. So great.
Yeah. Now we'll do that, and we'll make available well, on the website when we post your presentation, the links that you've also sent in the chat, so people can follow up on that also.
Great. Thanks,
Great.
Hector.
Hey, thanks, Laura. This has been really great, very, very interesting, and we appreciate the time that you've spent to talk to us about your work. This was a great finishing piece to the series that we've had today, and really think it was great. So appreciate your time. And so with that, I'm going to close this and also our season. This was our season finale, and hopefully there's enough of a cliffhanger this season finale to keep people coming back. But we will be back in the new year with another series of webinars on topics that are related in some way, not necessarily directly, to questions that surround the development of gene drives, but hopefully will be of continuing interest to those who are following us on this webinar series.
Great.
So Laura, I'm going to thank you again, and it was great.
Yeah, thank you all for the great conversation. I look forward to further talking. Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Happy holidays.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.